Hello students, welcome to Litbard. Today we are going to discuss on new criticism, the language of paradox. The question is explain Cleanth Brooks' concept of language of paradox. So let's start. New criticism was a movement in the sphere of literary theory that dominated American literary criticism in the middle decades of the 20th century. The movement is named after the John Crow Ramson 1941 book, The New Criticism. New critics focused on the text of a work of literature and tried to exclude the reader's response, the author's intention, historical and cultural context, and moralistic bias from their analysis. It emphasizes close reading, concentrating on the relationship with the text that give it. It focused to discover how a work of literature functions as a self-contained, self-referential aesthetic object. The Language of Paradox, seminal essay by Cleanth Brooks on new criticism, was first appeared in 1942 in The Language of Poetry, a journal published by Princeton Unit Press. Now it is included in the well-wrought and studied in the structure of poetry. Brooks, who is well known for his innovative and new conception of close reading of the text, here examines the places of paradox and irony in the poetry and illustrates his viewpoint by an analysis of poems of such poets like William Wordsworth and John Donne, who have very little in common with each other. His comments as a theorist are always supported by close readings. He believes in the unity of poems not as something mechanical but as something organic. He lays emphasis on the point that literary language conveys a special kind of meaning or knowledge different from that of science, which is one-dimensional and unambiguous. Scientific statements are purged of every trace of paradox, but paradox is the language appropriate and inevitable to poetry. A paradox is a self-contradictory statement or statement which brings together opposite ideas, which however conveys some essential truth. Such a statement is often introduced by writers to startle and surprise and thus want to capture attention. A paradoxical statement is highly intellectual in tone. It may be appear absurd and fantastic, but a little reflection that is essentially true. Sophisticated writers make extensive use of paradox to make their readers think and drive home the truth. On the other hand, irony is that of language opposite in meaning to the one rather intended by the writers. It is this instrument sarcasm and satire. Paradox may simply wonder or it may be ironical. Both irony and paradox are indirect or oblique way of expression and can be used by the intent and the witty. As poetry is an expression of emotion and imagination, one naturally thinks that paradox and irony have nothing to do with poetry. But in the present essay, Brooks establishes the fact that paradox is the natural language of poetry. First of all, he selects Wordsworth's sonnet By the Sea and Upon Westminster Bridge. In the very opening lines of the By the Sea, he gives the clear picture of a calm and quiet evening and compares such an evening to a nun. Wordsworth, a lover and worshipper of nature, is impressed by the calmness and quietude of the evening. He filled with worship and adoration, but the girl accompanying him is not. She is not worshipped, but the paradox is, she is still divine. God is inside her, but unknown to us. Thus, this sonnet is based upon the paradox, and the paradox states a contradictory statement. She is divine and God is always within her because she possesses sympathy as a nature and not merely with its more noble and solemn aspect. Her unconscious sympathy is her unconscious worship. She is in communion with nature all the year, and her devotion is continual, whereas the poet is sporadic and momentary. There is another paradox in this sonnet. The evening is compared with a nun, and obviously quite calm, free, and the outward trappings of a nun stand in sharp contrast with the inner holiness and innocence of the girl. In his close reading of Wordsworth's poem, composed upon Westminster Bridge, Brooks maintains that the poem offers paradox not in its details but in the situation which the speaker creates. Though London is a man-made marvel, and in the many aspects in opposition to nature, the speaker does not view London as a mechanical and artificial landscape, but as a landscape made up entirely of nature. Since London was created by man and man is a part of nature, so London too is a part of nature. It is this reason that gives the speaker the opportunity to comment upon the beauty of London as he would a natural phenomena. And as Brooks points out, can all the houses sleeping rather than dead because they too are endowed with the natural spark of life granted to them by the men who had built them. Brooks picks up Wordsworth's own statement from the preface to Lyrical Ballad to drive home Wordsworth's preoccupy with paradox to reveal the familiar world in a new light. Wordsworth had stated in his preface that his general purpose was to choose incidents and situations from common life, but ordinary things should be presented with to the mind in an unusual aspect. Brooks further argues that Coleridge clarified this and went a step forward to explain the paradoxical nature of the poetry and life as a means of objectifying the charm of novelty of things of everyday. Brooks analyzes John Donne's The Canonization to prove his argument. He ends his essay with a close reading of the poem which uses a paradox as its underlying metaphor. Using a charged religious term to describe the speaker's physical love as saintly, Donne effectively argues that in rejecting the material world and withdrawing to a world of each other, the two lovers are appropriate contenders for canonization. Though it seems to parody both love and religion, it in fact combines them, pairing unlikely incongruous circumstance and demonstrating their resulting complex meaning. Brooks seemed to regard paradox as a quality in language. Paradox, in his view, is a device which compensates for the limitation of conventional language and thus the only way in which poets can express the conventional and deeper insight. Paradox for Brooks is not just useful and entertaining but necessary. Paradox, he writes, is the language appropriate and inevitable to poetry. I hope this video is useful for you, and thanks for watching this video.